Welcome, welcome. Welcome to the Center for Gender, Women, and Global Leadership. We are an interdisciplinary department, and we're an interdisciplinary department with a vision to be a center of excellence for Black women, feminist consciousness. And so we thank you for attending this event on today. So this event is part of our global dialogue leadership series. And so today we're hosting an event with the former Prime Minister, Gillard. Would y'all please give her a hand clap? So we thank you for joining us on today. And we're just going to get our program started. And so we're going to have welcome remarks from our great Provost Anthony Booth. So y'all give him a hand clap as he comes up.
Thank you, Dr. B. Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I want to make sure everyone is still awake. It is certainly my honor and my pleasure to be here and bring greetings on behalf of the university. I want to first acknowledge and thank Dr. Dawuni for her leadership of the Women's Center at Dr. B. And I also want to acknowledge Ambassador Dawuni Hunt, who is part of the advisory board for the Women's Center. And it is a special honor for me to be here to bring greetings and welcome former Prime Minister Gillard from Australia. And I'll explain why I shared with her why this is a special privilege for me. You have her bio, but just to acknowledge a few high points that she was the 27th Prime Minister of Australia and the first and remains the only woman to serve in that role. I was sharing with Christian came up and made a comment in greeting the Prime Minister that he remembers a speech that she gave 10 years ago. If you're not familiar with it, she, in October 2012, received worldwide attention for a speech that she gave to Parliament on the treatment of women in professional and public life. I'm looking forward to the interaction this afternoon, and certainly want to welcome her to Howard University. On a personal note, I also shared that my father did his doctoral studies and attended the University of Queensland in Australia. And my older brother was also born in Australia. And as I was sharing that with her, I mentioned, oh, well, my sister was born in Wales or in Liverpool, where my dad was attending the University of Wales. And she said, I'm Welsh. So there are a number of connections I wanted to acknowledge and thank her, first of all, for being here and sharing some of her experiences as a woman in leadership, things that we can learn and can benefit from. And certainly also want to acknowledge that Howard University, as an international institution, we have students here from all over the world, certainly students from Australia as well, and look forward to continuing to build collaborations and partnerships, and want to welcome her on her first visit to Howard University, and certainly hope that it will not be your last. So welcome.
Thank you, Provost Booth. In other words, he says, welcome to the Mecca. At this time, we're going to welcome Ambassador Dawuni Hunt. Ambassador Dawuni Hunt sits on our advisory board. Please give her a big hand clap as she comes up.
I start with something I would never let my students do, which is to apologize for the fact that I have to go over to the Hill at some point, and also what a joy it is to see the provost again. As you know, the provost's office is a very big supporter of the Women's Center, and when I started that at Harvard, where I taught for 20 years inclusive security, what we did was to say that women, like the Prime Minister, they were the key. They were the key. And when Hillary Clinton whispered to me once, she went at a book signing, she said, getting women to the negotiating table, that is the only way we'll have global security. Am I right? And I said, absolutely. So this is very, very, very important for you here. I can't say enough about it. And I have to say that Dr. Dawuni You all are so lucky. If you don't know her, just every chance you get, go to anything she's doing, take her classes, tell everyone around you how spectacular she is. Women's Center here, it's right what you all need here at Howard. I'm so happy for you, so happy for you to have Jorpa and others who are part of this group, and it's an honor for me. I represent diversity, by the way, on the advisory board. They're very lucky to have you too. Okay, y'all, I will turn this over. I don't want to take a second more than of your time.
Thank you. I'll give back a big hand clap for you, please. At this time, we want to really take the time to just acknowledge our special guest, and that is you, former Prime Minister Julia Gillard. So I want to introduce my great director, phenomenal director. She don't like to be praised, but she really deserves to be praised, and that's Dr. Dawuni, Esquire. But we want to thank Dr. Dawuni for all of the incredible work that she does to pull these type of events together. She's an associate provost. Associate provost. Maybe I'm speaking things into the 60s. But she's the associate professor in a political science department, and of course, the founder and director of the Center for Gender, Women, and Global Leadership. Please give her a hand clap as she comes up. And now we're going to also welcome Prime Minister. To get my paperwork together here. The former Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. Julia Gillard was the 27th Prime Minister of Australia and the first and only woman, I'm going to be repeating some of the stuff you said, Provost Winter, woman to serve in that role. Since leaving office, she has dedicated her time to advocacy, governance roles, and writing. In 2021, Julia was appointed chair of Welcome, a global charitable foundation based in the UK, which supports science to solve urgent worldwide health challenges. Julia is also the founder and inaugural chair of the Global Institute for Women Leadership at King's College London and chair of its sister institute at the Australian National University, GIWL. GIWL serves for a world where being a woman is neither a barrier to becoming a leader in any field, nor a contributor to negative perceptions of individual leadership. In 2014, Julia joined the board of Beyond Blue, one of Australia's foremost mental health awareness bodies, and has served as chair since 2017. As a lifelong advocate for increasing access to education, especially in developing nations, Julia was chair of the Global Partnership of Education from 2014 to 2021. Julia wrote My Story, a memoir based on her experiences as Prime Minister. Her second book, Women in Leadership, Real Lives, Real Lessons, co-authored by Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, I hope I said it right, explores the challenges women face in leadership. Her third book, Not Now, Not Ever, 10 Years on From the Misogyny Speech was released on October the 5th, 2022. Please give a big hand clap for former Prime Minister Julia Gillard.
All right, Dr. Bean, thank you very much for the introductions. Once again, I would like to echo what Dr. Bean said and welcome everyone here. Thank you for making the time to spend this moment with us. It's going to be life-changing. I would also like to give a special recognition to my colleagues who are here, Dr. Krista Johnson. Welcome, Dr. Sefokil, welcome, and my colleague, Ms. Sharon, and for any other colleagues I may have missed or who will be coming in, I recognize them. But most importantly, I want to thank my staff and my volunteers, Dr. Bean, who is the Assistant Director for the Center, Fauzia, who is in the back, making sure everything runs, LA, our media person who is walking around taking pictures of you, and of course, the wonderful students who volunteer at the center, including Kobe over here, Wesley, Yasmin, who is an ambassador here. And so there are many opportunities at the center for you as a student to volunteer, to just worship and fellowship with us, and to learn more about women. So I think we'll jump in right away. I am going to be moderating this session, and I would like to say that Prime Minister Gillard, she likes to be called Julia, but I will call her PM Gillard, has to catch a flight. And so as soon as we are done, we're going to take one group photo and she's out. And so if you want to see her again, we will arrange for you to visit her in London or Australia, but let her go as soon as we're done. So this is a wonderful time. Thank you really for making the opportunity to be with us here at Howard. And we're going to be talking about your book, as introduced by Dr. Bean. I must say that we have a raffle, and she's graciously agreed and brought all the way from Australia 6 books to share. So the 6 lucky winners, you must have gotten a raffle ticket when you came in. We'll be drawing at the end to see who's the winner. But this is an amazing book. And as introduced, it's built on many of her experiences, but most importantly, what some of you may know as a misogyny speech. If you don't know about it, look it up, watch it, and you'll be happy you did. So Prime Minister Gillard, for those who don't know, I saw the video, I read this several times, and I kept going, really? Wow, it just doesn't surprise you what misogyny does. So tell us a little bit on the background of what led to that speech on the floor of Parliament and into this book.
Thank you very much. Is that on? Do I have to do anything? Oh, I do. Okay, right. Yeah. Note to self, turn microphone on. That's pretty obvious, isn't it? Thank you for the question, but can I start by saying thank you for having me here. I'm very delighted to be here. I'm also delighted you've now all got an invitation to come and see us either in London or in Australia, because I always like it when people visit Australia, so you should be taking that invitation up. But yeah, it's absolutely great to be with you. To start with the misogyny speech, when I became Australia's first woman Prime Minister back in 2010, of course, I knew that that was a big thing to have happened for Australia to have the first woman to become a leader, and we're still obviously waiting for that to happen here in the US. And I came to the job a committed feminist. I've been a feminist all of my adult life. And so I wasn't naive about the nature of gender discrimination and the way that it holds women back. But I also thought, wrongly as it turned out, that the maximum reaction, both positive and negative, to me being the first woman to serve as Prime Minister would be experienced in the early period of my Prime Ministership. Positive in the sense of I thought there would be a kind of you go girl reaction from a lot of people who were very delighted to see a woman finally get to that job. But I thought there would be discomfort too, and that would be expressed in its most intense form in the first few months of me being Prime Minister. What actually happened was the longer I was Prime Minister, the more controversial the things became that the government was doing. Inevitably, governments make big decisions. People agree with them, disagree with them. The political waters get more troubled. What actually happened was the longer I governed, the more gendered the critiques became. So when the government was the subject of attack, when I was the subject of attack, the kind of go-to weapon was a gendered insult. But because I'd made this assumption that the gendered stuff would fall away, when it happened in the early days of my Prime Ministership, I hadn't shone a light on it, I hadn't called it out. And so when it happened with greater intensity, it was quite hard to call it out, because obviously if a government is in troubled political waters and you point to sexism or misogyny, it's an easy dismissal for people to say, oh, well, she would say that, wouldn't she? Because she's trying to distract from the fact that her climate change policies are controversial, or her education policies are controversial, or whatever. Fortunately, with the benefit of hindsight, it didn't feel particularly fortunate at the time, but fortunately, the Australian Parliament gave me the opportunity to address all of this sexism and misogyny. And to just paint the context of that for you, in the Australian Parliament, we have a thing called question time, which happens every day the Parliament sits. The opposition is entitled to ask the government basically any question. Disproportionately, those questions get asked of the Prime Minister, and you've got to answer them, and they are without notice. You don't know what questions are coming. But in the lead up to question time, you can often make a very seasoned guess about the likely questions that are coming, because they normally follow the media agenda for that day. And the day of the misogyny speech, the media agenda was about the fact that the man who was Speaker of the House of Representatives had been shown to have sent some very sexist text messages, and I had supported him to be Speaker. Of course, at the time I had supported him, I couldn't have known about the sexist text messages, but, you know, you don't want to let the facts get in the way of a political attack. So I still knew that I would be under political attack that day, and I would be particularly being challenged as someone who was a sexist and, you know, was hypocritical about these issues. And so getting ready for question time that day, I think what descended on me was a real feeling of frustration, and I've described it as cool anger, that after so many times when I had been treated in a sexist or a misogynist way, I hadn't called it out, I just sort of taken it, I just endured my way through it, that now after all of that, I was going to be the one accused of sexism. What happened when I went into the Parliament that day is, instead of having question time, the opposition, the leader of the opposition, particularly a man called Tony Abbott, moved an immediate debate. So a debate that was going to start instantaneously on sexism. He gave the opening speech, and what's come to be known as the misogyny speech is my speech in reply. And if you'd said to me at the time that we'd still be talking about it 10 years later, I would have thought that that was completely ridiculous, like crazy talk. But here we are, and we are still talking about it 10 years later. And I think that is because it's become divorced from the parliamentary context of that day, and it's come to mean something to women in particular, also to some men, but to women in particular, because I think almost every woman has the experience where she's been treated with sexism or misogyny, or she's hit a gendered barrier, and she hasn't either felt in that moment that she could call it out, or she has called it out, but called it out in a way she's not happy with. And I think we've all had the experience of waking up at 3 a.m. with the sort of perfect one-liner in your mind, but unfortunately that sentence wasn't on your lips when the thing happened the day before. I think most women can relate to that experience. And so the speech, giving voice to women's outrage and offence and frustration and tiredness around the continuation of misogyny and sexism in our world. I think the speech has sort of got a resonance, a continuing resonance because of that. I knew at the start of this year that the fact it was the 10-year anniversary would be a bit of a media thing in Australia. And so rather than just let it be a media thing defined by what journalists wanted to write on that day, I decided instead to sort of grab hold of it and say, well, as the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, we're going to shape how people think about this event. And that's what gave rise to the book, Not Now, Not Ever. So we published that to coincide with the 10-year anniversary of the misogyny speech. And it is, in the first bit of the book, the story of the misogyny speech. But I always wanted to kick the agenda forward. So the balance of the book is women writing from different perspectives on misogyny, and the conclusion of the book is particularly the voices of younger women and what we can truly do to fight misogyny and end it. And we have had, alongside the launch of the book, particularly in Australia, but also an event in London, where we've brought people together to talk about misogyny, and the Australian events in particular were put together for very large audiences, but to showcase the voices of young women who are really at the forefront of this gender equality fight today. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Right. Well, thank you very much. So you've given us a good overview of what happened. And if you look into the book, you actually see her handwritten notes when she was putting together her thoughts. And it's to think that you didn't really plan to have this conversation. But it's so beautiful, it's so well said. You would think she had rehearsed it 100 times. And I think that's what you talk about, the full anger. That women, when we respond to these things, people tend to think, oh, she's angry. And of course, if you're a Black woman, you know, there are other accolades, not so as much accolades, but there are other terminology that would go with that type of anger. But it gets to that point, women have to express it. So in the book, Not Now, Not Ever, you also wrote from the experiences of other women. So as you mentioned, it's intergenerational and it's also cross-sectoral. You interview people. So you have comments from individuals like Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's your co-author, who's currently the first woman to be the head of the World Trade Organization. You have a statement and remarks from the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Theresa May. You have a statement from Regina, blanking on the last name, who is the first Black woman Surgeon General in the US, who also recounts her experience with misogyny. So based on all these experiences of the women recounted in this book, what's a common thread or theme you find in women's experiences of misogyny?
I think that's a really good question. And, you know, we asked people to write from their personal experiences. We also asked them to write from different topic base. So you will find an essay in there from a woman called Mary Beard, who's a classicist, and she talks about the history of misogyny going right back to, you know, Homer and ancient times, talking about where misogyny comes from. We look at violence against women, misogyny at work, and the list goes on. I think, you know, if I was going to distill a common thread, I think across all of the essays, you can see and feel the intense frustration of each of the women who writes that this is so much part of our world. And no one writes from the perspective, obviously there's some older women who write, some younger women who write, but there are no women in there who write saying, you know, for example, I could have written saying, you know, I'm 61, and when I look back 40 years to when I was 20, whole lots of things about misogyny have changed and whole lots of things have got better. You know, no one actually does that. What they do instead is they talk about how misogyny is still there, is still intense, but over the years it's sort of shape-shifted. And so, you know, at some points, and I can recall these points in my own personal life, people would have face-to-face said to you things which were incredibly laden with misogyny. Today, people are far less likely to say things to you face-to-face, but then you open up social media and it's just a vile sewer, and you walk away shaking your head, asking yourself the question, is there more misogyny now because this is so bad? Or is the anonymity of social media enabling it to be expressed more? Has it always been as bad as this, but it used to be a bit more hidden? And I honestly don't know the answer to that question, but I think the sort of shape-shifting way that misogyny still confines women's lives and women's choices really comes out very strongly as a theme of the book.
So shape-shifted. And so that is why maybe towards the end, we're also going to look at the strategies that we have to shift to meet those changes. Now, in the book, you do an excellent job. You account some of your experiences and the experiences of other women. And we find out that women leaders, irrespective of whether in politics or any other, have faced misogyny. But I refer to a particular chapter in here, written by Dr. Aleda Borges, who it's in the back, and she works as a researcher at the Institute in London. And she writes on the intersectional nature of Black women's experiences with misogyny. And in the US, most of our audience would know the terminology misogynoir, which I've seen many notes, which in essence is the intersection of misogyny and race. So Black women's particular experiences with misogyny. And so how in your work and in compiling this book and all the experiences and people you've engaged with since this speech, have you observed the particular ways in which misogyny has affected and continues to affect Black women, women of color, and in the Australian context, First Nations peoples?
Very happy to answer this question, though I feel a great deal of pressure to get it right, given the lady's just in the back there. So if I go wrong, she can come and correct me. I think for me, prior to spending as much time overseas as I do now, particularly with Aleda and others at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, where because we take a cross-sectional, intersectional lens to the work we do, we talk about these issues very, very deeply and constantly. But before this period in my life, when I was active in Australian politics, where I would have most thought about these issues is in the context of Australia's First Peoples, so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians who, of course, are there, having experienced everything that comes with Australia being colonised, intergenerational trauma, decades and decades and decades of dispossession and exploitation. And, across the years of change that there have been in Australia, and so much change is still to come, but across the years of change when land rights have been recognised in Australia, so the fact that our Indigenous peoples had the original ownership and title of Australian land, and that it can't just be taken without compensation by mining companies and pastoralists and the like. So that wave of change, the wave of change that has come around the reconciliation agenda, where, when I was in school, basically Australian kids were taught, Captain Cook arrived on a boat, and hell, that's the start of Australia. That was Australian history. That is no longer taught in Australian schools. The tens of thousands of years of Indigenous history before the arrival of anybody else is now told, and that culture is respected. So across all of those debates and changes, the debates and changes we've looked for in terms of political representation, trying to overcome economic disadvantage, educational disadvantage, and many of those agendas are still very current and very live. In all of that, there has been the public and private discussions by Indigenous women about how they, as Indigenous Australians, want to see a better Australia which is truly inclusive and reconciled. And yet in the change journey that they're involved in the structures where Indigenous Australians come together to mobilise, collectivise, work out how they want to go about this struggle, there's a gender dynamic. And, Australians like Professor Marcia Langton, who I interviewed for the podcast that I do for the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, talks about this and how decades ago she formed a Black women's organisation because she wanted to surface within the dialogue of Indigenous Australia the dimensions of gender inequality. So, with all of that, I guess I can say I've seen in my lived context, my own nation, how those dynamics play out. And then as, I work with the team at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, because we do try and take a truly global perspective, you then see how they play out in different cultures and contexts. Aleda writes very powerfully about Brazil in Not Now, Not Ever. You and I had a conversation this morning about here in the US, and trying to understand the intersections of gender and race and how they come together and compound and exclude. And how for, those of us who have always labelled ourselves as feminists, for women like me, how we get better, deeper, more thoughtful about what it means to truly work in an intersectional way and to have feminism embrace, the full dimensions of what we need to change, not just the dimensions we need to change for white women.
Thank you. So as you can see, and I mentioned this morning, Howard University is 70% female, 70% of our students are female, and they are very active in everything they do. And so I like that in the book, it was an intergenerational dialogue where you particularly talk to 3 younger women who also express their experiences with misogyny and how they resist. So given that knowledge and also that you're working within the university context in the United Kingdom, what would be your advice as someone who has experienced it at the highest levels, who is doing all you can to change the discourse and the activism? What would be some of the strategies you would share with our students in terms of their fears, their frustration, but most importantly, how they can continue to resist misogyny?
Yeah, I did interview 3 young women to conclude, not now, not ever, with the voices of young women. And just to give you a little sense of who they are, one is an Indigenous Australian, a woman called Sally, who there is a very profound call for change by Indigenous Australia, which is called the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And she and other Indigenous leaders are taking that statement, which calls for a constitutional recognition of the voice of Indigenous Australia in our political system, our parliamentary and constitutional system. She's one of the leaders in that, one of the younger leaders, but certainly one of the leaders in that. So I talked to a young woman called Chanel, who was, she's from Sydney. She was doing a master's in London. She decided to interrogate just in a few schools, and actually quite privileged schools in Sydney, what were the dynamics between boys and girls around the question of consent. And she sort of took the lid off what then became, across Australia, from many, many young people, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of stories of teenage girls who in their schooling context with teenage boys were able to recount what had happened to them, consent issues, sexual violence, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation issues. And out of that, she spiralled a campaign called Teach Us Consent, which has led to changes in the way Australian schools try and convey to students what it is for there to truly be consent and when that isn't there. And then the third was a woman called Caitlin, who has a very profound lived experience of family violence, a personal experience, but has spent much of her time on a program that takes young girls to Parliament. She's done that in Australia. She's done work on that internationally about how the voices of girls can be heard in parliamentary structures and how girls can feel like this could be a place for them because they've been there when they're very young. So 3 very dynamic young women. And, you know, the things they spoke about, which really stayed with me and which really rang true to me, is they can hardly believe that it is still as bad as it is. And they do look at, you know, my generation, and they're basically asking us the question, why haven't you got more done? Why isn't it better than this? So there is an intensity to the frustration that we're still so far away from a gender equal world, and that the journey to that world is measured, you know, in more than 100 years when we look at the bodies that do the indices of change. They're also a generation that is far less worried about being stylised as impolite or angry or any of those things. You know, I think an age-old tactic to shut women down has been to refer to them as, you know, shrill, hysterical, rude, angry, anger is such an ugly emotion, all of these one-liners kind of trip off people's tongues. And I think for a lot of women, that has not wanting to be perceived like that has held them back from a lot of activism and advocacy they otherwise would have done. And these young women see through that trick. They know that's what's going on, and they don't care if they're labelled the angry woman, the impolite girl, the one who didn't know when to shut up, the one who didn't know when to stop. They don't care that they're going to be characterised like that, because they see it in some ways as a marker of success, that they're provoking and irritating that response because it means they're having impact. And I think that's quite a different paradigm to the one that my generation thought about. And I think they're also very savvy, connected campaigners. Now, obviously, the technology of campaigning has changed, a lot since I was at a university all those years ago. But, the flip side of the vile misogyny on social media, the other side is that it's a powerful tool to bring people together on campaigns. I mean, we could not have globally had Me Too if we didn't have that kind of interconnectedness. And they are very savvy about how to use that to unite women across our nation, but across the world, to unite, to forge pathways and bonds that make a real difference to how women and men who support women can fight for gender equality. So it was a really perceptive conversation, a revealing conversation. I very much enjoyed having it, and then reducing it to writing for the book.
Thank you. So there's hope. Younger generations may be frustrated, rightly so, but they are also more passionate and then continuing in the resistance. And Howard University students don't shy away from resistance. So that's a good, hopeful comment. I'm almost ending up now, so we can have questions from the audience. But there's been quite a number of studies recently from UN Women, McKinsey, and others who show that it's going to take over 100 years to close the gender inequality gap. And so what are your projections? What are some of the things that we can do as individuals, as collectives, as institutes to push and hopefully lessen that 100+ years of closing that gap?
That's a very good question, because 100+ years, I'm not going to make it. So I do want to see change far more quickly than that. I think it's the things that I indicated before, that these young women are speaking about and pressing on. I think it's all of those things. But if I could add one additional dimension, and in many ways this is the sort of core thread at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, the dimensions of the task in front of us, measured in decades and decades, more than 100 years, the dimensions of the task in front of us is so huge that it is, a tragedy if 1 minute, $1 is wasted on activities that don't have the maximum impact. And, what we want to do at the Global Institute is amass the evidence, the tools for change that definitely have the maximum impact, so that we don't, spend time doing things, sending women endlessly to women's empowerment courses or courses to try and make women more confident, because it's not women who need to be changed. It is the structures of our society, the exclusionary structures of our society, and the psychological stereotypes we all hold in our heads about what women are like. And the psychological research these days is very deep on that kind of stereotyping. So I think, the evidence-based tools that give us the maximum propulsion forward are really critical in this moment.
Thanks. So I think the last question I'm going to throw at you is, we have in the audience a few gentlemen. And so we do recognize and continue to recognize that the feminist struggle, the womanist struggle cannot be won by women alone, and should not. because men are half of the population of the world. And I would say in most cases, the problems that women have are caused by men. So they should be part of the solution. So in that spirit of solidarity, what are some of the ways in which male allies can be part of the gender equality struggle?
Well, number one, you're very welcome. Number two, I'm not sure we've always been as good as we should have been about including men in this conversation, but it's obviously true when you look at today's world where most of the true levers of power are still disproportionately in the hands of men, that if we don't have men as allies and involved in the process of change, then we aren't going to get there the way that we want to. In terms of what men can do, I think men have a huge role in calling out sexism and misogyny when they see it. Actually, this is in many ways a galling finding, but it's one that Ngozi and I included in the book on women and leadership. The research shows that if a man points to something sexist that has happened, say in a workplace, he is more likely to be believed and taken seriously than a woman who points it out. So that is kind of a galling finding. But it is because I think that if a woman calls it out, as I referred to at the start of this conversation, people can second guess her motivations. You know, is she only calling it out at work because she was the one who wanted the promotion? Is that what's going on? Whereas if a man calls it out, people don't see that he's got any second motivations. They just think he's calling it out because he's seen it and he thinks it's wrong. So men actually have got a powerful, tool at their disposal to shine a light on sexism and misogyny. So certainly that. Certainly wherever men end up in their careers, in their lives, if they've got power to make changes in workplaces and community organisations, through politics, through not-for-profits at universities, using that power in a way which is inclusive of women, inclusive of gender, and is pro the change that we want to see. Men being prepared to reach out and ensure that to the extent that they're role modelling, that they are sponsoring or mentoring others, that they do that in a way that also promotes women. A whole lot of the world is best explained by the operation of the Old Boys Network, which is really no more complicated than men who have got power and status thinking that they'd quite like to help a young man who reminds themselves a bit of themselves at that age. They'd like to give him a hand up through mentoring. And if men always give that hand up to other men, then we're just going to perpetuate those structures of power. So I think it's very important that men use that power in a more diverse way and to promote a more diverse group coming forward. I think all of those things, I think we want men, walking alongside us in this struggle. We don't want them walking in front of us because we're the ones who know where to go. We want them walking alongside us, but it's incredibly important that they do.
Thank you. So the men, you have your matching orders, and the women are beside you, so be beside us as well. Well, Prime Minister Julia Gillard, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. And this book is amazing. You should read it. You should watch the Misogyny Speech, and you should connect and converse. And I would also say the good thing is that the Misogyny Speech has become a TikTok, and there are some people who are using TikTok in different ways. And I'm hoping that some of our students here will do the Howard TikTok version of the Misogyny Speech, and then let us see. Yeah, she would like to see that. You never know, it might get you a ticket to London. So I think on this note, we would like to open up for questions from the audience. If you have a question, we kindly ask that you line up in the middle. We'll take a couple of those. Dr. Bean will hand over my microphone, and then the Prime Minister will do her best to respond, and we'll have to probably cut it off if we get too long a line, but please ask your questions. Thank you.
Line up in the middle, please.
Okay, I'm an alum for time. Hello. Yeah, M-A-M-E-D-P. And my question to you, darling, is
Yes, ma'am.
I did that yesterday at the mayor's stuff and they all got on me. But if you can you hear me back there? Teacher voice? Yes, I know it's here too. Yes, so I plan to go to Australia
right?
for my birthday in February. I'll be 75, but I'm older than you. You're a baby to me. So I have a few questions. So as a female, Howard University graduate, yes, but that woman is there like that. But wandering through Sydney and Canberra and Melbourne and Brisbane up there by myself, which I always do. Unless y'all want to come with me, but you have to pay for yourself. What would your advice be as a Black female? I mean, how do I dress? Do I just dress like I am now? You know, some countries have to dress a certain way, otherwise they'll be putting me in jail. Another question is, will you be there? Because I want to come and visit you. And the last question is, oh yeah, I'll be going to Tasmania and New Zealand. It's a cruise, and then I'll be adding on at the top end and the bottom end of the cruise.
And you're going Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Tasmania, New Zealand.
You know, the cruise is going all around Australia,
Oh,
all
all
around
around.
Wellington, blah, blah.
Okay.
And ending in Sydney. And then I'm going to add like 2 weeks in Sydney at one end and 2 weeks in New Zealand at one end. So I want to know your advice. And I also want to visit Aborigines because I always like to visit Maroons and those kinds of people in Bolivia and everywhere. I've been to 89 countries, so I'm trying to make 100 before I reach 100.
Wow.
Goals.
Okay, I'm a very good tourist advisor. It's one of the things that you end up knowing through Australian politics because you spend so much time travelling around the country. First piece of advice, February it'll be hot. The further north you are, the hotter it will be. Well, if you don't like cold, you're in absolutely the right place if you're going to Australia in February. I, because I'm not that smart, won't be in Australia in February. I will be in London in the winter weather instead of Australia in the summer weather. So I hope you enjoy that summer weather. If you're on a cruise, then you'll presumably just be in the coastal regions and not without the time to get, right into Central Australia, outback Australia. But in every, Australia's Indigenous population is, highly urbanised. There are people obviously who still live on country, but, a large percentage of the population lives in urban Australia. And so there are, Indigenous Australians, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, wherever else you go to, that if you wanted to reach out and forge a link, then you would be able to do that. I don't, apart from staying cool, I don't think I've got any great advice on dress. I think
Short.
if you like, if that's your thing, go for the short shorts. I'll be cool. That's true.
And I was in Wales in May.
Oh, you were in
Cork.
in Cork in Ireland? Were you in?
I was in Ireland, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. I've emailed you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Further tourist tips are available.
Thank you. So we have a question here. I'll keep it there tonight. Anybody else have a question? We want questions from the students.
There are quite a few students from my class, so I expect questions from them. My name is Marilyn Seyfolk. I'm a professor here at Howard University, and I wear the angry Black women badge, like a badge of honor. So back in the early 1990s, in 1995, I gathered at Howard University the first group of women ambassadors that one could count on one hand. For the first time, one could count on one hand women ambassadors. That was in 1995. So in 2000, I wrote a book called Then They Were 12. because finally they reached the double digit. And some of the struggles that they are mentioning are very similar to what the women are reporting also in your book. So things are changing, but very, very slowly at snail pace. I just wanted to know what your intake was regarding sexism. We talked about sexism and racism, misogyny. But I want your take about sexism and ageism, because sexism and ageism are very much alive. People like Hillary Clinton, Nancy Pelosi, they are kind of cast aside as older women who don't have something more to contribute. And we have seen it also in Saudi Arabia, where the women who have fought for the right to drive are no longer on the scene. They have actually put them in prison. And they are highlighting now the young women who are entitled now to drive, thanks to the struggle of the older women. So I wanted your take about sexism and ageism, which is alive everywhere, including at our own institution.
Yeah, that's a very good question. One of the when Ngozi and I put together the Women in Leadership book, one of the things that women leaders that we interviewed spoke about, and these were women leaders from across the world. So we did speak to Hillary Clinton, but we spoke to Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf from Liberia, Joyce Banda from Malawi, Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, and the list went on. And each one of them, despite very different cultures and contexts, all spoke about being disproportionately judged on appearance and there being disproportionate interest in appearance. And I think the ageism manifestation you're talking about is a part of that. We psychologically, because we've always been, moving through a gendered environment, I think everything about our gendered environment teaches us that we can, in some ways, weigh a woman's worth depending on how she looks. And that doesn't play the same for men. People would probably know in recent days, very recent weeks, the former Prime Minister Johnson, Boris Johnson, has exited the Prime Ministership in the UK, but he's famous for, absolutely famous for, his disarranged hair, his hair being everywhere, his shirt being untucked, his shirt being dribbled on, his tie not done up right. He looks a mess. And this is all passed off as an amusing sort of personal eccentricity. But I asked Theresa May, also a former Prime Minister, if a woman in the Conservative Party had the same dress standards. She emerged every day with her hair looking, like it was everywhere, looking like her clothes weren't that clean, with her clothes looking dishevelled. What would happen to her? And Theresa May said, a woman like that wouldn't even be selected for Parliament. Because if we saw a woman like that, we wouldn't just go, oh, that's eccentric, she doesn't care about how she looks. We'd go, that's telling us something about her lack of organisation. That's telling us that she's someone who's kind of on a weird edge of disorganisation. We look at a woman and we think we can judge her character from things associated with her appearance. And I think ageism is part of that, because we succumb to the view that a woman who is old is no longer of relevance. So whereas men are viewed to become kind of grey eminences, this is why they have historically had news readers who were older men, because an older man reading you the news was seen to be a voice of authority. Women, once they hit 40, were basically retired off the TV screen because they were seen to be too old. So I think, you know, fighting ageism and fighting sexism in some ways are the two sides of the same coin, because it is really pushing back against this notion that we are entitled to be weighed and judged based on how we appear to the world, rather than in terms of what we do.
That's really interesting. Ready? I want to piggyback off of the conversation before I open the floor for a little bit of more questions. There's a YouTube figure that I'm thinking that the audience would know. He passed away recently, Kevin Samuel. If you know Kevin Samuel, raise your hand. Right. So he talks about women, right? He talks about this ageism piece. He talks about if you're 40, only way for a woman to secure a man, secure a husband, have a job is if she's under 40. Like, you know, if she's over 40, then she's not able to secure a man. And so this what you're talking about, Professor and former Prime Minister, is not something that's just in the past, right? But on the news, this is something that people of your generation are actively talking about. And you may not be 40 yet, you may not be 30 yet, you know, but you're going there. Your mamas are 30, your parents are 40, and they're doing incredible things that some of us haven't reached that point yet. And so where I'm going with the conversation is these YouTube talking heads is what I call them. These talking heads is that your generation has to be the generation to make those TikToks and to push back. That my intellect is not on my body and my clothes, and how I show up is what's in my head. And it's not if I'm organized, if my hair is disheveled. I really just like wearing my hair like this. We just had the Crown Act passed, right? Or whatever, you know, so in terms of how Black women show up and the different intersections with sexism and racism and things like that. You know, we just had the Crown. We're actively fighting against things. So these are not conversations that we're casually having. It's on you, the next generation, to start to put those things in place. So start make TikTok videos, make your own YouTube videos. We are more than our hair. We're more than our clothes. I don't care if I'm disheveled or not. I'm smart. I'm beautiful. I showed up, and I'm Dr. B. You know, so, and you're a doctor, the next lawyer, the next communication specialist is on you to do that. So I had to kind of just fill in there because I know, you know, that these YouTube, like I said, the YouTube talking heads got something to say about y'all. I want y'all to have something to say back. You know, talk back, sis. You know, talk back. So with that, next question, another question. They're here first person.
Hi, I was Googling you and I saw that in 2011, Australia under you supported a no-fly zone in Libya. And so I was curious, was the destruction of that country, is that feminist? I mean, Libya under Gaddafi had the highest standard of living in Africa, the highest standard of living in the Arab world, and then NATO bombed it back to having open slave markets. So if slave markets are feminist, I mean, I'm out.
So, I mean, I can understand why people would look at foreign policy decisions that I took when I was leader, or you know, President Obama took when he was leader, you know, around Libya or around many other questions, that people would look at those decisions and say, we don't think they're right. And such is the nature of politics that we should always be having these debates and you challenging me and saying, that's not right. What I think we've got to avoid, though, is women politicians are going to mess up, get things, do things well, do things badly, as many times as male politicians, women business leaders, women university leaders, and we've just got to make sure that the edge of the debate isn't, and I do think because we have a sort of hero feminism thing, we easily get ourselves there, and I genuinely mean we easily get ourselves there, is we look at a woman leader and we go, she's amazing, like amazing. You know, people in the contemporary world would have looked at Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. She's amazing. She's foregrounding kindness. She's leading in a different way. I think she is amazing. But the problem with the promotion to the top of these pedestals is everybody's human, everybody's going to get something wrong, and it's a long way to fall. So this sort of, putting the women who make it through, any of them on pedestals, I think is kind of setting themselves up for an ultimate failure. So, no. What I'm saying is, the decisions on foreign policy, you and I can and should debate that. That isn't telling us anything, though, about the nature of feminism, because it is perfectly possible, and I'm not necessarily, I don't want people to say, oh, she's conceding all these arguments about her foreign policy, but it is perfectly possible for someone to live their life and try and make a difference for feminism and gender equality and still do a series of things that you think are ultimately wrong. Those two things are perfectly possible because no one's perfect, no one's the perfect feminist, no one's the perfect political leader. Politics isn't, full of people who call it right every time. It's full of human beings who make errors. So the, value set around gender equality and feminism, I don't think turns on whether or not one did or didn't support a particular policy about Libya.
Thank you for the question.
Hello. I have a lot of different thoughts that I'm trying to formulate into a question, so it might take me a second to get there, so bear with me. But I think part of what my comrade Eli, was bringing to the table is sort of what I'm chewing on now, which is like, even in our Black feminist theory class, which is the reason why I'm here, we really talk about these narrow dimensions of womanhood as if they're like the only intersections that exist are race and gender, and that even within gender that there's like this cis normativity, you know what I mean? That there's only this like binary of cis woman and cis man, and that we know that there's everything in between, and then there's also, women in quote unquote developing, or I would rather say like intentionally underdeveloped countries, who have the experience of their womanness that looks very different from yours or mine or anybody else's. And even like in this country or in Australia, there's poor women who are having these different experiences, and women, without citizenship that are, and on and on and on and on. And so the realm of womanhood is so vast, and I think it's actually as vast as the human experience, and yet we continue to talk about feminism in these very narrow lenses. And so I guess this is going to be a two-part question. So the first part of the question is like, what does it look like to, fight for feminism that truly accounts for the vast human experience of womanness, not as like a biological thing, but a sociological experience, which is what it is. And then I think the second part of the question, and is something, for a young person who's thinking about what it takes to really make the radical shifts that we need in the world. And, you were talking about how it's going to take 100+ years to close the gender gap. We don't even really have 100+ years on this planet, like the way that climate change is advancing. And, so there is a way that the last chance we have is collective liberation, and that we will only survive as a human race on this global scale if we recognize the way that all of our liberations are intertwined. And I think feminism is a really important piece of that. And I think continuously over history, one of the first goals of a movement is to get people in positions of power. And that, we saw this with Black liberation movements, and we had in the US our first Black president. And I think we can all agree that not much has shifted really. And I think that is probably, the same thing for any marginalized group of people, that having a person in a position of power within the status quo does not change the status quo itself. And so I guess the second part of my question is, what do you think it takes to change the status quo itself, and is it possible to operate within it and radically change it, and like what is necessary to change the structures that you were speaking to that hold up this status quo with this like understanding of this vast womanhood that I was talking about before.
What a question. Okay.
Very, very good question. And I wish we had many days to talk it through, but to try and order my thoughts and give some sense. I agree with your analysis. I agree with your analysis. The way I look at the dynamics of the current power structures and the radical shifts that we need to have a viable, inclusive, just future on this planet, I think we've got to be doing a few things all at the same time. And, you know, in our work at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, we're conscious of that, because at the same time, we're basically saying there are many pyramid-style power structures in our society, parliaments, corporations, universities, and we want to see women come through those power structures, be represented at the top in equal numbers, and not have artificial barriers that are just there because they're women placed in their way. We want to do that. At the same time that we want to interrogate the question, what does leadership look like anyway? And is that, the getting to the top of the power structure, is the existence of the power structure in that form the best way of leadership being shown in a neighbourhood, a community, a nation, the whole globe? And so I think we need to be doing both. And in part, the very urgency of the problem that you point to requires us to do both. So, for example, it matters who leads nation states and goes to COP and talks about climate action and possibly agrees further measures for change. It matters who does that, at the same time that it matters that we're interrogating whether economies and societies that have been based on consumption, that growth is always good with no other paradigm of what it is to live a good life except material accumulation, that we should be questioning all of those assumptions. But if we only did that and didn't worry about who went to COP, we wouldn't be getting there. If we only worried about who went to COP, then I don't think we'd be interrogating the vastness of the change that we need to see to truly deal with climate change, to truly deal with gender inequality, with racism, with all other forms of intersecting exclusions. And so it's complicated. And you know, people in trying to lean into the it's complicated, you know, each of us, I think, can do the piece that they can do the best. You know, for me, obviously, with my lived experience, having been a woman leader, the only woman to lead my nation, obviously that means I've got a unique experience. No one else on the planet has my experience precisely. I think I can be the best agent of change I can be by leaning into that, and that necessarily takes me in the direction of speaking about trying to change gender inequality. But that doesn't mean that in all of this complexity and vastness and difference that there's not millions and millions and millions of other ways of leaning in. And if I'm leaning in on that and you're leaning in on something else, and you know, we're all leaning into the sort of progressive cause in different ways together, then hopefully the sum of those efforts ends up being truly transformative.
Thank you for that, and thank you for such an incredible question. You most definitely asked us really broad gender question that is, my brain is still like, I'm trying to comprehend. But I really appreciate the question, like, what does gender look like in Australia, the progressive gender look like when you're away from America? We know that we only have like one trans person here, or one, person elected there. Like, what does progressive gender look like when you get to another country? You had a question, Dr. Johnson?
I was just gonna say, you need to come to my class.
I'm enjoying your students' question. We'll take, we have to take one more. We'll take two more and then we'll have to go. Actually, can we take three more and then we'll cut it off? So one, 2, 3.
I think one thing I'm struggling with in this talk is that the existence of women who are in political spaces or political forces is like inherently feminist or like more so anti-patriarchy. I know you started it off talking about Hillary Clinton and something that she had spoken about, saying more women in these spaces. And then we can also talk about Hillary Clinton and her vast amount of policies and the way that she has encouraged the disenfranchisement of specifically Black people, but also Black women in her political career. So I just have to ask, we're seeing more women become politics. Being invested in politics and also becoming politicians at the same time, specifically with white women. It's like you are also advocating and are at the forefront of anti-abortion policies, of all these policies that are inherently anti-feminist and pro-patriarchy. So I just have to ask you, what is the work that you think for women who are in politics? What do they need to do to, unlearn that? Because I don't feel represented in you. I don't feel that you are for my best interest. I don't think me being a Black person, that's not the only contributing factor to being able to speak on Black liberation or what it means for Black people to be free in the society, just as being a woman is not the bare minimum factor. And so then I think that's just my question, because it's like, you're a woman and you are also advocating for anti-abortion policies. You're advocating for, I think we can see a lot of the ways specifically white women will weaponize white womanhood, white motherhood, and white innocence, and advocate for more disenfranchisement of separating maybe Black women from their children and using those type of systems of oppression against Black women. So I just have to ask you, in my head, I'm like, yes, you can be a woman. Well, actually not even in my head, but I can understand why somebody might say more women in these political forces will do a lot. But, as Bell Hooks said, patriarchy has no gender. So what are we doing? I have these conversations with Black women, but I guess you being a white woman, it's what are white women, especially in political forces, especially their history, especially in Australia with the way Aboriginal women are treated. It's what are we doing? Because it's yeah, we can make a few mistakes, women, supporting women's wrongs. At the same time, it's violent, and it's violent towards women that don't look like you. So I just have to ask, what do you think about that? Because that's something I've heard throughout this whole talk.
Yeah, okay. To try and fit, I'm just thinking, confusing myself. Certainly not every woman who ends up with power, whether that's in politics or some other sector, is going to be a feminist who would enact an agenda that I would agree with, that I think you would agree with. There are certainly women who advocate anti-abortion. I'm most assuredly not one of them. I've been pro-choice all of my life, but there are women, clearly, particularly here in American politics, with all of the issues with the Dobbs decision. But I think in addressing all of that, we've got to just categorise a little bit. Women should be able to come through for leadership without any gender-based barriers in front of them, even if the things that they are arguing for are not things that I would agree with. Here in the US, I'm not a citizen here, but if I was a citizen here, a woman Republican president ought to be able to come through without having her appearance criticised, without the gendered words that are used against women being used against her without any of the artificial barriers. She should be able to do that. I wouldn't vote for her, but she should be able to do that. I'd vote for the person who represented me in the policy sense. So, you know, sister political party is the Democrats, so I'd vote for the Democrat candidate. So, you know, I think we can all at the same time be saying we want a world where there are no gender barriers to women coming through for leadership. That's kind of, you know, the starting point. But in who we support in politics, we will support people who align with our views. And for me, that's always been on the progressive side of politics. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody I've ever voted for I've agreed with 100%, but they better align with my politics than the alternative. So, you know, here in the US, people will obviously have their criticisms of individual politicians, and that's absolutely, you know, it's got to be like that. But I think we can still have the dialogue about gender inequality, even while we're disagreeing on a whole series of other issues. In politics too, contemporary politics today, the anti-feminist backlash is being harnessed for political effect. And it's being harnessed for political effect, in my view, deliberately, because there's a lot in populist politics here in the US and in other parts of the world, which is really about saying that people are trying to find, conservative people are trying to find the mechanisms that take politics back to a realm that they were more comfortable with. So less women involved, less diversity, which is why things like, I think, the Dobbs decision and all sorts of other things have become weaponised in US politics, and trying to confine women's reproductive choices has been weaponised in the politics of other parts of the world. So I absolutely share your concern about that and what it says about the you know, every wave of feminist advance gets the backlash, and I think this is part of the backlash. So we should be shining a light on that, fighting against it, whilst it, if I touch that. I think I'm out of battery. Thank you. I do have a big loud voice, so I think, you know, we've got to be shining light on that whilst we're still saying, you know, we're for no barriers for all women. Sorry, I don't think I put that very elegantly, but I hope it made some sense.
Thank you for the question. We're just gonna take this last one.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, we're gonna have to, because they really need to catch their flight. We need them to get back. We'll take your question, have to be very quick, you know, because we have to
Sorry, I'm the
take a
one
group
probably
picture.
not being quick.
It's a quick question. Thank you to all my other classmates who have said very insightful questions. Thank you for asking. So I feel like my question is simple compared to everyone else's, but for someone who is at the beginning of their feminist journey, they've just been awakened to it. How would you suggest that they work on deconstructing like sexism, misogyny, and mindset? Even because we can call it out on a macro level, but like on a micro level, like, what does that look like? And
Thank you.
I think that's a good question, and I think it's actually not one that's of a simple answer, because the thing I always want to say is, you know, navigate the world calling out sexism and misogyny as you see it, and that's the only way that we're going to bring about change. But of course, you know, whether or not any one individual can do that in a particular moment depends on the power dynamics in that moment. It's one thing for me to stand up in the Australian Parliament and give the misogyny speech as Prime Minister. That's one thing. It's another thing when you're, you know, the newest recruit in a workplace, you know, to call out sexism and misogyny in that workplace when you're the person in the power structure with the least power. So I absolutely understand that whilst we all want to call out sexism and misogyny as and when we find it, there are times when people can't. And I think the best that in those moments people can do is look to the collective and try and forge the allies and links that would enable others to work with you and potentially call it out with you. So, you know, it is always, you know, in a class at a university, in a workplace, in a political party, if it's one woman trying to say it, that can be really hard. If it's 10 women, 100 women, 1,000 women, 10,000 women, then that makes a real difference. And so finding those interconnections. You know, for my own political career, you know, when I first became interested in going into the federal parliament as a representative of the Australian Labor Party, so the political party of the left in Australia, at that stage, the percentage of women in the Labor Party in National Parliament was 14%. So of all of the Labor people that got to go to the National Parliament, only 14% of them were women. And the only way ultimately that got changed was by women coming together and saying, we aren't going to have the political game played this way anymore. We're going to make sure that there are rules and systems changes, which mean women have to get fair representation. And now, you know, the Australian Labor Party is in government in Australia and half the representatives in the federal parliamentary Labor Party are women. So, you know, my experience has always been that, you know, by working together, by maximising the number of people on the same cause, you get the biggest amount of change.
Thank you. So I think you've seen, like I told you, our students at Howard don't hold back and they come at it from the heart. And I think that last question, all the questions were great and we need to continue those discussions. But I think the last question and your response is the idea of calling it out. That is where, speaking from the perspective of a Black woman, we also need our white sisters to call it out. And so not now, not ever means that we work in solidarity, which is what you promote, and through your work at the Institute in London and New Zealand, and with our center here at Howard, I think we can work together and bring Black women, women of color, First Nations people, women in all definitions of